This was 2 days before official word of the Declaration of Independence reached Maryland, so this was kind of our own doing. And the most telling thing is kind of the first line in this so-called Declaration of Independence of Maryland of July 6th, where they wrote, "No ambitious views, no desire for independence, induced the people of Maryland to form a union with the other colonies." And then they went on to say we were just basically forced into it. You know, talk about reluctant rebels. I mean, Maryland was dragged kicking and screaming towards actually declaring independence from Great Britain. And as far as Maryland's political elite is concerned, these very conservative people that control Maryland politics, independence had simply become an unfortunate necessity. Maryland couldn't afford to be the odd person out of the 13 colonies declaring independence because of our geographic centrality and a number of other things. We just, you know, we had to join with the others, but we were very nervous about the whole thing. Okay. Just to review why Marylanders were so reluctant to support independence. Britain had the greatest land and sea force in the world. They just defeated the French in the French-Indian War. Highly trained, experienced professional officers, large navy that could effectively blockade the coastline of the American colonies, vast economic resources. The United States, I mean, you know, that term United States was kind of a propaganda document. We weren't united in any sense of the word. In fact, the old rule of thumb is that about a third of the people, the colonists, supported independence, about a third opposed it, and about a third were fence-sitters, or in Thomas Paine's characterization, sunshine papers. Whichever side was closest, you supported them. So no unity at all among these now former colonies, now self-declared independent states. We had no navy at all. Each of the now self-declared states created their own navies, including Maryland. A few trained or experienced officers either on land or sea. We were staple producing colonies, very little manufacturing, particularly outside of New England. We had no uniform currency. Every state had their own currencies. So maybe Maryland's political leaders were right in being reluctant rebels. The chances of us beating the great power of Britain was pretty remote. Let's talk just briefly about Maryland's first state constitution. You know, if I'd been involved in declaring independence against the greatest land and sea force in the world, and I lived anywhere in the vicinity of Annapolis, I would have gone home and said, "Maud, pack the kids and the essentials, we're heading for the hills." Because it was going to be dangerous to be anyone identified with independence living along the coastline. In fact, Maryland's leaders took a whole different approach. They decided, what's the most important thing? What should we be doing over the next few months? Why don't we write a constitution? And in fact, strangely enough, since written constitutions were not the norm throughout Western Europe, 11 of the 13 original states promptly set about writing written constitutions. We had just since 1763 being involved in this great political debate with Parliament and British politicians, had found that any time something was written down, from Magna Carta to the Bill of Rights to any of the other relatively few written down documents Britain had in its arsenal of legal charters, that's what we could grab onto because it's written down. It's something that you could point to, a phrase or a guarantee. And so this had become ingrained in the colonists by 1776. So 11 of the 13 decided, we got to sit down and write ourselves a written constitution. So in the midst of the threat of being overwhelmed by the greatest land and sea force in the world, Maryland and all these other colonies set about constitution writing. In Maryland, it was not a quick process. It took from August until November. The most important part in many ways of Maryland's first constitution was its Bill of Rights. They called it a Declaration of Rights. It was by far the most lengthy and elaborate of any of the states. We had 42 articles in our Declaration of Rights, guaranteeing things like no taxation without legislative approval. It eliminated the poll tax supporting the church, absolute separation between the executive, legislative, and judicial functions, freedom of religion for all Christians, no state support for any religion. It allowed Quakers, Dunkers, Mennonites to affirm rather than swear that accommodation that Lord Baltimore worked out way back in 1660 with the first Quakers. Guaranteed freedom of speech and trial by a jury of one's peers. All these things that seem so critical and important to us today were in Maryland State Constitution, the first one, 1776. Is there something up there? The legislative branch consists of a House of Delegates and Senate. 4 delegates from each county, 2 from Annapolis and Baltimore. So Annapolis and Baltimore had separate representation, elected by all free men, age 21 and over, who had a stake in society, at least 50 acres of land or other property worth 30 pounds. So just not everyone. You had to be an established member of the community. Going to be a very popular, responsive House, 1-year terms for delegates. The Senate, on the other hand, was going to be a check on that very popular base. Lower house, just 15 members of the Senate. They were done regionally, 9 from the Western Shore, 6 from the Eastern Shore, indirectly elected by electors. So they were going to no direct election of the senators by the voters. The voters would elect electors, 2 from each county, 1 from Annapolis and Baltimore, who would then gather together and elect the senators. What's that remind you of?
Oh, does it ever?
When the Constitution was written in Philadelphia, clearly the model for the Electoral College was Maryland's indirect election of senators. No one wrote down, gee, Maryland's got a brilliant idea, why don't we use that for the Electoral College? But that's what it is. I mean, that's the principle, and we were the only ones that did that, so we were the obvious model for it, but no one just bothered to write it down. So once again, Maryland gets left out of the history books. They had 5-year terms, so the idea here is indirectly elected, 5-year terms. They were going to be a very stable body, far removed from the electorate. They had to be 25 years of age, have estates worth 1,000 pounds, so you could gather everyone in Maryland eligible in be in the Senate in a room much smaller than this. The executive branch, in reaction to the very strong executive we had under the Charter of Maryland, the first state constitution created one of the weakest executives of any of the new states. 1-year terms, a 3-year term limit. You had to be 25 years of age, have an estate of at least 5,000 pounds. You could get all those people in kind of a little corner of this room. So just very prominent and well-to-do people were qualified to be governor. But even then, the governor could make very few actions on his own because there was a council of 5 men established, and almost all actions had to be done in the name of the governor and council. So a very, very weak executive in response to the very powerful executive the colonists had battled all through the colonial period. The governor and council were elected by the General Assembly, so again, indirect election. You elected your senators and you elected your delegates. They then would gather and from amongst themselves would elect the governor and the council. The first governor they elected was Thomas Johnson of Frederick County, originally the family from Charles County. Thomas Sim Lee, I don't know if there's a portrait of him, strange since it's a Lee. And then William Pake, the third governor, 3 1-year terms for those folks.
There's a fabulous portrait of Thomas Sim Lee's wife.
Of his wife.
Uh-huh.
Maybe we could put a beard on her or something. You can do wonderful things with Photoshop. Provisions of Maryland's first state constitution, the judicial branch. The Court of Appeals was established as the highest appellate court, and the county courts were left much as they had been in the colonial period. They had worked so well, why make changes to something that provided great stability and responsiveness for the local citizens? The one change at the local level is that county sheriffs, who previously had been appointed by the governor, were now elected. That's to make, when the sheriffs come out, bang on your door, going to foreclose on you for, a debt not paid. It's nice to have someone that you know. So a local person who has been elected, but they didn't want to run the risk of appointing someone who would let all the debtors off the hook. So the county sheriff had to have an estate of at least 1,000 pounds. So a very wealthy person had to be elected The first, during that process of writing the first Constitution, one of the issues that came up was the lack of representation for the rapidly expanding western section of Maryland. So the last convention created two new counties, Montgomery County and Washington County. Montgomery County named for General Richard Montgomery, the great early American hero who had been killed on the attack on Quebec at the end of 1775. And then Washington County, named after, of course, the commander-in-chief of the American Army.
I think I read something that those were the first two counties named after somebody not from England.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Huh. I've always wondered if that isn't the first geographic place name in America named after General Washington. I mean, it was pretty much a flop up to that point. I can't imagine anyone else naming it after him. But,
Montgomery County, it said, was the first
well,
one.
Montgomery, well, Montgomery, yeah, Rich Montgomery. I don't know. Yes. You know. All right. So.
First call.
Lower down, Jamie.
In Maryland. Oh, sorry.
Whoa.
I'm trying.
Now, again, an indication that this was not a real democratic government. The convention was written and approved by that last extra-legal convention, the Ninth Convention. There was never any thought of giving this out to the citizenry for approval. They were happy with it, so they approved it, and we had our first state constitution. Went into effect in November of 1776. As I mentioned, the first governor is Thomas Johnson of Frederick County. Look at this gilt-edged Senate. This isn't all of them, but George Plater, William Peka, Daniel St. Thomas Jennifer, Charles Carroll, the Catholic who couldn't have held off. Oh, that's the barrister. Then Carroll, he's Protestant. Carroll Carrollton, Catholic. Thomas Stone, Matthew Tillman, Robert Roseborough. I mean, this Senate was something. A very conservative constitution. Probably no other constitution was as conservative as the one written here in Maryland. It was intended to preserve political stability at a time that was going to be fraught with all kinds of instability. Anytime you have a revolution, it's going to be a lot of instability, and Maryland's political leaders did whatever they could to try to create a stable government for Maryland in a time of revolution. Maryland, during the War for Independence, I'm going to say very little about Maryland during the War for Independence because it bores me. And you know, if you want to read about battles in the war for, there are about 1 million books about it. Read away. I just want to look at a couple things at the very beginning and at the end of the war. Despite the reluctance that Maryland had to support independence, once we cast our lot with the other colonies, now states, no state contributed more than Maryland did to the ultimate victory of the American Army in the American Civil War. And you need to remember that and impress upon our visitors, particularly if they come from Virginia, and rub it in. Unfortunately, and you don't need to mention this to our guests, no battles were fought on Maryland soil. Is that sad or what? I mean, the state tourism people just freak out about that. But, yeah.
Greg, in what respect did we contribute the most in terms of?
We're getting to that.
Well, our men were very well trained.
Huh?
We had very well trained soldiers.
Well,
Better than a lot of the colonies.
we had soldiers that would obey commands. That's what we had.
Is that what we had?
Yeah. We have three nicknames that tell the story of Maryland during the War for Independence. The first one is Crossroads of the Revolution.
Sorry.
The second one is Breadbasket of the Revolution, and the third one is the Old Line State. Crossroads of the Revolution, the Chesapeake Bay was the giant freeway of the colonial period. So both sides would get up the head of Elk, get on boats, and whiz right down to Norfolk, or vice versa. So if you got to the central part of the American colonies / states, you could get your army in great haste from one point to the other as long as you had boats. And both sides did that. Unfortunately, they never ran into each other in some tourist-appropriate place here in Maryland. So, you know, they just, bad. Breadbasket Revolution, in part because we never had the enemy occupying our land, it meant that the farmers and planters of Maryland could go big time into foodstuffs for the American Army, and it was never interrupted. So we were a consistent supply of food for the American Army throughout the war, and particularly at the very end at Yorktown. We were the ones that really supplied that huge army that amassed around Yorktown. And then the Old Line State, which is by far the oldest of Maryland's nicknames, refers to the Continental Line soldiers, familiarly known as the Old Line, the Continental Line. That army directly under the command of General Washington. It was the American Army as opposed to the state militias and the state regiments that the different states created. So the Old Line State refers to the role of Maryland soldiers as really being among the best in that regular army commanded by General Washington, the Old Line, or Continental Line. So the question is, why were Maryland soldiers so good? And I'm going to start that discussion by looking at just 3 events at the very beginning of the War for Independence. The first, the Battle of Long Island, which occurred on the 27th of August, 1776. It was the first major battle after independence was declared in July of 1776. Basically, we have a red dot, it doesn't seem to show up. This is Manhattan Island. This is over in Brooklyn, and the problem was Washington had his army in this area, but he had terrible spies at this point. He couldn't rely on anyone to tell him the truth. And they'd come, breathlessly into camp and say, the British are off over there. Where's off over there? Well, over yonder. And, well, how many of them? Lots and lots and lots of, 10 or 100 or 1,000. Lots and lots of them over yonder. And so he wouldn't know what to do with intelligence like that. And then someone else come in and say the British are off yonder in that direction. So he did something that was absolutely stupid. If any of us was elected general tomorrow, we wouldn't do this. But he did it. He had about 20,000 soldiers in New York, and he split his forces right down the middle. He kept 10,000 on Manhattan, because he thought the British might attack there. He put 10,000 over here in the vicinity of Brooklyn, because he thought they might attack over on the south side of the East River. He didn't know where they were going. These people coming into camp were saying they were there, or they were there. So he just split his army down the middle, and thought, if they attack, I'll try and get the other half over, depending on where they attack from. So very poor intelligence. The problem was Admiral Richard Howe was in command of this huge British fleet, and it landed 20,000 troops down here along the shore of Long Island, and during the night of the 26th, they made their way up to where the 10,000 troops that Washington had here were, and by the morning had them surrounded. Once the troops were landed off the Navy ships that were commanded by Lord Admiral Richard Howe, they came under the command of his brother, General William Howe, and he led the attack of these 20,000 professional, hardened, trained, experienced British troops and German mercenaries on these 10,000, to call them raw recruits was saying a lot for them. Some of them, like the Marylanders, had just barely arrived. I mean, they had no experience whatsoever, had never fought in any battle whatsoever. So it's a very desperate situation. I mean, the Americans, on the morning of the 27th, realized they are surrounded, and what are you going to do? The commander of the Maryland troops and the ranking person who was assigned to Brooklyn was Captain William Smallwood from Maryland, who had just arrived with those flying troops that had been authorized in June by the Maryland legislature. He was on Manhattan Island attending a court-martial. So the ranking American officer in charge of these 10,000 troops was a man named William Alexander, who called himself Lord Sterling, and he went to the ranking officer of the Maryland contingent of those flying camp troops that arrived in New York just days before, Major Mordecai Gist of Baltimore County, and he detailed 400 Maryland troops to him. These are absolute raw recruits, no experience whatsoever, and he gave him the charge of delaying the British as long as possible so he could get as many of the remaining men off and over the East River, across Gowanus Swamp, across a river to the relative safety of Manhattan Island. Can you imagine? I mean, your commanding officer comes up and tells you that. I mean, if the blood would have drained out of your probably I would have fainted. I mean, it's not a chance in the world. I would have been anything other than prone and a dead faint if I'd been told to do that. Major Mordecai Gist simply turns to his 400 Maryland and says, well, here's the task. We got 20,000 British troops charging us, and we got to stop them. So, Gist and his men